Another longevity wisdom pod with Luis Rios today. He's PhD. He's a longevity entrepreneur, venture capital consultant, and drug discovery scientist. Fun story. Luis won the prize of the most reschedules in for the podcast. We rescheduled like 6 times, and even funnier. The last time, I don't know how it happened. Maybe in my rush between all the meetings, but I invited Louis to a Kickstart call of mine for my clients, and then Louis joined, and it was my team, and he was like, "Who are these people?" So that was so weird. But I'm quite excited to speak to Louis today. He's heart and center in longevity. He's based right now in SF, quite nomadic, and he's coming back from a cool conference in Montenegro with Vitaly Buterin, which we'll talk about today. But first, Luis, can you introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about your companies?
Yeah, I'm excited. We finally got to meet, after a few chats while I was in Montenegro. Yeah, my name's Luis Rios. I was a scientist in academia for 10 years. Initially really interested in neuroscience, at UC Berkeley, and then in Osaka, Japan, doing that work. Eventually ended up at the Salk Institute, where I became really fascinated with circadian rhythm and studied intermittent fasting, as well as the neuroscience of how the brain keeps time, the 24-hour rhythm. And that actually was my first intro to kind of lifestyle interventions for longevity, is intermittent fasting with Sachin Panda, who recently became public intellectual with his book. So he's done quite well since I left the lab, promoting fasting. Then went to Stanford University to study drug discovery and mitochondria. There, I discovered a novel type of anti-inflammatory compound that I spun out as Fission Pharma, where I'm developing these small molecules that protect mitochondria during inflammaging or chronic inflammation. So that one of the core problems with inflammation is that it disrupts metabolism, and this can lead to degeneration of tissues. Yeah, spent a while in venture capital. I was partner at Vine Ventures, initially investing in psychedelics, but then we pivoted to longevity. So I helped them transition to that, and also director of research for ImmuneAge Bio, where we are trying to rejuvenate bone marrow. So, generally involved in somewhere between academia, venture capital, and industry. And you really need all three to kick out early stage technologies. So that's my specialty is kind of sitting between those three and getting everyone to talk.
Just the average stuff. When you like tell your aunt or like your friends what you do they often like respond to say, what, dude? Because to me this is all like normal slang. We speak the same language, the language of moonshots. But what about your social interactions with common mortals?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we are able to convey our science to lay people. And you have to get good at not using jargon and being able to communicate in a way that they'll understand, or else you kind of just talking to make yourself look cool, right? Ultimately, your end goal has to be to communicate something that they're interested in. So I actually have, interesting conversations with my family. I come from a family that didn't have anyone in academia, so I've gotten good at talking to them about what I do in a way that's understandable. So
Let's talk about your background. No academia. Like, where are you from? What are your origins? How did you get to this world? And what kind of impact will that make in your family tree?
yeah, so from California, grew up in San Diego. My family is working class. Became really fascinated with philosophy and chemistry and pharmacology from a young age. About 16, was introduced to psychedelics and was completely blown away by the relationship between matter, something completely understandable, like a physical, chemical, and the mind. And that really launched my interest in neuroscience, drug development, chemistry, and a lot of things that I'm still inspired by today.
So you're kind of a not kid for sure, because I did psychedelics too, and I've been fascinated, but not at the degree to try to understand them, or at least at this young age, right? Should we call it that my brain wasn't as developed back in these days? I was quite the philosopher and loved to go deep in my conversation. But yeah, if I would picture myself at 16, like a very bro-y um, Charles, and yeah, doing psychedelics and seeing Lewis that is like fascinated by his trip and going to study it, I'd be like, yeah, Lewis is definitely that artist or weird type of guy. So like, were you? Why were you that way? And why did you take that path while I and most people just take these things recreationally? And what was the trip exactly, if you can tell?
Yeah, I think I'm just really fascinated by science. So I think I just took to it, and it was a really transformative experience. I had mushrooms and just went for a hike, and it was completely revolutionary in my life. I don't actually use substances, very often, but that was really pivotal experience to just see the tangible relationship between something physical and the mind, right? Went to UC Berkeley to study philosophy of the mind and chemistry and biology, all these things, just to try to really understand what's going on. And it's been really inspiring to see the societal transition, to wake up and realize that the drug war against these compounds has been absolutely insane, and they absolutely have therapeutic potential. That's been shown. It was shown in the 60s. So just, really taken by the injustice of the societal, stance against them. And I'm really happy to see people coming around, at Vine Ventures. That was really the inspiration for that fund, is just, being part of this social movement to normalization and medicalization of these compounds. So we'll see MDMA FDA approved this year by MAPS for PTSD, psilocybin's close thereafter, probably next year. And it's just going to blow up from there. So it was really cool to see behind the scenes of like this burgeoning field. But ultimately decided to pivot to longevity, because that sort of also, inspired me, I think, to watch my parents age and myself age. I'm in my 30s now, 32. And it's really, it really took me like how unexamined people's opinions are on longevity. A lot of people have really negative stances towards it. And upon examination, it just didn't really make sense to me, like, well, one day, hopefully soon we'll figure this out. And then to let people die, given the knowledge, right? It's almost like someone has cancer and you know how to treat it, but what are we going to do? Just let them die? I mean, that's somewhere between murder and medical malpractice. So yeah, I think this is really the new frontier in medicine, is medicines that focus on the aging process itself.
Right. There's many areas to explore here. I want to start like step by step, because each topic are super interesting. How much time do you have, by the way, today? Like 20, 30, 40?
I can go over a bit. Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think we're going to go over
Yeah.
starting with the trippy part, if you want. I'm on psilocybin right now, for the record. Microdose it in my tea. Super helpful, makes me playful and creative. And I have my usual coffee, and as a biohacker, it's like a cocktail of supplement and so forth. Super helpful. So much so in 2020, I think I began making my own pills. I was in a part of Mexico that in the mountain, the shrooms they grew. And yeah, I researched all of it, and my background is in I did the nootropic. That was my first startup, just for the record. So the trippy part of it, and the war on drug argument, folks like you and I, like we're very much like on the libertarian front, so it's kind of easy to see it. But there's also the fact that most people, they use drugs for recreational purposes, and it arguably it has a pretty bad effect on them. Yet I do think that even if that's the case, the government can first legalize them and stop putting people in jail, and have more productive people in this society, not people that we pay for to have in jail, but people that actually make something for themselves, make themselves a living, and pay taxes. So that's, yeah, completely ridiculous. It's also ruining a country, right? Mexico. So what are your thoughts on that? How, if you were like in power, how would you deploy this to make sure that people do not abuse of it? There's probably an education part of it, and it's always tricky when we talk about education, super tricky topic. But how would you deploy that one?
Yeah, I'm for, complete legalization of safe drugs. So drugs that that you're not going to overdose on or do physical harm to the body directly. Alcohol and cigarettes obviously do tremendous harm to the body, and alcohol is one of the major causes of preventable death in this country. So
Right, drunk
the
driving and so
current
forth.
state of things is such that this is a problem we have to face through, education. Ultimately, we have to consider whether the damage done by prohibition is greater than that is done by having free access, education, quality control, all of these things. I think there'll be a transition period, like people will have to learn what these are. How most of us do that is we're in high school or college and someone gives us something. We have no idea how much active compound is in there or even what it is. We take it under who knows what situations, and we quickly find out, what is happening there, which doesn't have to be the case. There could be a lot more awareness, education about these things, about how to use them responsibly. There is certainly a risk with psychedelics. It can be quite traumatic to have a bad trip. But the question is, how are we going to build a society where those harms are minimized and the potential gains are maximized? And I certainly do not believe that prohibition has led to that society by any means. I also think they play a critical role in longevity. One of the major criticisms of longevity by intellectuals like Elon Musk is that, by extending people's lifespans, we will end up with the ossification of society, a gerontocracy of people that are 100 years old plus. They have a lot of the money, a lot of the power, but their minds have become inflexible. And I know
Which
that
is somewhat of a valid point, but I do think that, yeah, these I think that's a point you're making. So sorry to cut you off, but maybe these compounds, these psilocybin and psychedelics, maybe they can unlock these doors.
exactly, yeah, like how do we maintain plasticity, malleability, adaptability in the mind through age? And I think that psychedelics could play a role in continuing to enhance creativity and adaptability so that we do not get the ossification of society, even in current day society, where a lot of the power is held by old people.
Right. And I spoke that point to David Wood, which is a futurist, and he was like, yeah, there's a lot of young people in power too, but I think it's really a minority. And I've raised that point many times because these minds are so inflexible. First, they're not representative of their population. Second, they don't listen to the younger folks, which are in charge of kind of adding value to this society. They're kind of the R&D department, right? They're recycling the bad stuff that's happening in there. But yeah, first longevity, I think it will fix the economical problem, because we've got Houston, we've got a huge problem if we start declining in pop. We arguably, I do think we're living in abundance, yeah, because of innovation and entrepreneurs, but just because this population keeps growing from a pure economical perspective, I do think people are going to have their planets as well. They're going to start colonizing left and right. So gerontocracy, well, if they're the case, I think people just move and decide to not stay there. Staying in the trippy phase of things. And yes, I do use these compounds sometimes, not heroic dose, but like high dose to get into trips. Recently, I've discovered the power of psilocybin to get in very deep meditations. I didn't know that before. I was always the social. I still did it for spiritual reasons, but it was like, let's do this together, right? Because there's always the fear also of the bad trip, which yes, indeed can be somewhat damaging if you let it be damaging, because I think the mind can manifest what it believes. That being said, yeah, I'm gonna do these solo trips soon enough to open my mind and to understand things. And I think it accelerates the mental digestion. I call it that way. It really makes just like solar flares. It surfaces the stuff that has been too deep inside you and didn't want to come out. And there's so much value in there. And there, I also view these events as hard stuff. You know, they're not supposed to be happy, jolly. I view them almost as Ironmans and test of the mind, you know, to test my grit and my resilience, because it's very uncomfortable sometimes to get in these dark places, which naturally you're gonna get into. But question for you to stay in that trippy part. You studied the relationship of time and perception, I believe, in the brain. So that is really, really trippy. It almost breaks my brain when thinking about it. What were your findings into that study?
Yeah, so I was studying a nucleus in the brain that encodes the 24-hour clock, the circadian rhythm, right? So not time perception really, but my work in Osaka focused on the relationship between rhythm and memory. So a lot of our memory, a lot of our cognitive capacity is actually guided by rhythmic
Or heart or respiration mostly? Or
so no, like anything, for instance, in memory, you recite the ABCs, you do it with a rhythm. A lot of our physical motor movements are rhythmic in nature, right? When we get into flow states in music, we have incredible memory capacity, but that is unlocked through rhythm and the compressibility of rhythmic encoding of information. So that was, sort of some of the things that I studied directly, but not really time perception, which I think is a whole nother fascinating field.
yeah, let me estimate the time right now. I think it's around 3 p.m. 2:52. Um, so basically my point was more like is the because the only constant beat is the heart and the respiration, right? So if I want to guess the time, in which I'm pretty good at, I do think it must be related to IQ and memorization as well, and habit. um I think these would be the only constant. I do agree with the point with the flow state, and I constantly use music to get into that flow state, but it's somewhat trippy to try to think about time, right? Because yes, there's a rhythm, there's a constant rhythm, which is your heart and your
Yeah,
respiration, but
even in your language, how
yeah.
you're processing information, thoughts, and conveying them, you're doing it with cadence, with a rhythm.
Hmm.
And what you see is that people who are talking to each other, who relate to each other well, these rhythmic brain cycles, these waves that are waves of electrical activity that are happening in the brain will actually synchronize.
Okay.
And so right now, in order to convey information well, our brains are actually synchronizing in rhythm.
Hmm.
And so it's not just the
From a
heart.
distance,
From a distance, yeah, across the planet, where
because
you
of rhythms, right? Doesn't have to do with waves itself, but like, yeah,
yeah, it's fundamental to how the brain works, how we store information.
And you started your career that way in Japan, like fascinating. Okay, let's shift gears here and
Yeah,
start talking about like the next stuff on your CV, which is equally, if not more than impressive. Tell us about the. Should we skip straight up to the mitochondrial stuff? Or
sure.
would that be a too big of a leap?
No, let's jump right in. So during my PhD work at Stanford, I was studying this peptide called P110. And it had all of these really interesting properties. It was tested in 19 different disease models and prevented, all these different types of neurodegeneration, cardiac ischemia, stroke, irritable bowel syndrome. It seemed to be a highly generalized anti-stress or anti-inflammatory peptide. But peptides,
Explain what peptide is and how
yeah,
many
peptides.
peptides are
So
there.
all of our body is made of proteins, and a small fragment of a protein, which is a string of amino acids, so like beads on a string. If it's a short fragment, say up to 20 amino acids or so, this is called a peptide. And we were discovering these peptides by studying protein sequences and predicting short sequences of the proteins that were going to be bioactive. And we engineered them to disrupt.
Explain bioactive.
Yeah, so bioactive being they would interfere with some process in the cell, right? So all drugs, they're somehow interfering with signaling that's happening in the cell. Pretty much all drugs are now, all small molecule drugs are binding to these receptor sites, like for instance, serotonin receptor for psychedelics. These receptors evolved these really wonderful pockets that were designed to grab onto small molecules like serotonin. And a lot of the psychedelics mimic that, which makes sense that we can find small molecules that would sit in these pockets. But that is only a tiny fraction of the information processing that's happening within a cell, is this small molecule binding to a receptor. There's this whole world of information processing that's governed by two proteins that are just sticking together or not. That's a vast majority of it compared to just receptors, right? So peptides are cool because they can do things that are really hard to do with small molecules. They can actually mimic a whole chunk of a protein and block a protein-protein interaction. There are some small molecules that can do this, but they're relatively rare. It's an emerging field, and this would dramatically expand what is druggable. Only a tiny slice of biology is currently druggable, but we're looking to expand that with peptides. But peptides have a lot of downsides, which is that they can be digested. They're not orally bioavailable. They're broken down by these enzymes that chop them up, called proteases. So this peptide had all this promising activity, but it was never able to be translated into a therapeutic for humans. So during my PhD, I was studying this peptide. I figured out how it worked, where it bound to the protein, and I used in silico drug discovery to design small molecules that would mimic this peptide, and it worked. It was actually quite lucky. Like this compound I pulled from a computer within a series of 6 months had done all of the biochemistry and cellular work, and even got it into animals, and was able to show that this compound had all the same activity, but was much more stable than the peptide. So I got super lucky. I've never seen a project where you've pulled a small molecule drug from an in silico screen and got all the way to animals and showed animal efficacy in one fell swoop. And
What
that
are
was
the
after
odds of that? 1 out of 10,000?
I don't have stats on exactly, like a lot of this stuff is not published, but I'd say very, very low odds. But studying the protein, I saw this motif that told me that this was very likely to be how this peptide was working. This like kind of apparatus on the protein, this like loop. And I was studying this in the computer, and I figured this got to be the spot where this peptide is acting. So I got super lucky that the in silico model worked. Now, I spun this out as Vision Pharma. We're using AI to screen for a whole library of compounds that can have the same activity, but can have improved drug-like properties. So, oral bioavailability for it to get into the brain. And we hope to use these compounds to treat neurodegenerative diseases, as well as a whole host of inflammatory diseases. So a very generalized anti-degenerative, that's protecting mitochondria as opposed to inhibiting the immune system. You know, a lot of our anti-inflammatories work by just blocking the function of the immune system. But this is a totally different approach. Instead of blocking the immune system, we're trying to preserve metabolism. And if we found that if we preserve metabolism, inflammation could be happening, but you don't experience the degeneration. So for instance, we tested it in a mouse model of sepsis. Normally, if these mice get sepsis, they have total metabolic collapse. They have no energy. Sepsis is when you have a really exaggerated response to a bacteria or a virus, and you go into immune shock. And what's happening, there's a lot of things that are happening, but one of the end results is that you have total collapse of energy production. So you see these mice, they are totally wiped out. You know, they can't really breathe well, they can't really move well, and their body is flooded with all these inflammatory signals. With the compound, the mice still have a substantial amount. 80% of the inflammatory signals are still there. So their immune system's functioning. And it's even generating all this inflammatory response, but they still have full energy output. So they're running around the cage, they can breathe just fine, and they don't die of the critical symptoms of actual organ failure that you see in these severe inflammatory responses. So we think it's a totally different approach to inflammation. As opposed to targeting the immune system, we're targeting one of the major downstream detriments of inflammation, which is degradation of mitochondria, degradation of energy output. So that's the idea with Fission Pharma.
It's fascinating. Heck of a discovery, like the 1 out of a 10,000 chance. Sometimes we control luck and serendipity. So how did you get there if you had to guess? Is it like you doing a bunch of research? Is it your strong intuition? Is it you microdosing, biohacking in the lab? Like if you'd have to pick a couple of circumstances that led to that, because yes, there's luck, but I feel there's a bit less luck than we think here. So if you'd have to guess, how do you think you get there that fast?
Well, the truth is that we have a huge number of graduate students, postdocs, professors trying all sorts of stuff, and there's constant failure. So for 3 years, I was trying big ideas. You know, I was trying to engineer infectious mitochondria to transfer young mitochondria into like an old diseased animal. Totally didn't work. You know, I tried all sorts of things, big moonshot ideas, and for 3 years, and nothing worked, right? And so then, you know, maybe the 5th idea I took a stab at was this in silico model. So I think just the sheer number of all of us trying all of these things is required to get lucky and to find the one idea that's going to work.
Yeah, I think the keyword here also is in silico. So what software were you using? Have you been using AlphaFold, and how is AI going to change the game here?
Yeah, so I use Mo, a molecular operating environment, but now we're using AI in Fission Pharma. And basically, we're training the AI on, you know, what a drug is, especially the types of drugs that are going to sit into this protein and mimic the activity of the peptide. And so the AI learns that, and then it can screen a huge number of possible compounds to find ones that are going to behave like this. It's kind of like the AlphaGo problem, right? In AlphaGo, there are more moves than there are atoms in the universe. Because of the combinatorial nature of all these different routes, it's impossible to brute force calculate that. And drug discovery is kind of an analogous problem in that there are so many possible chemical compounds to screen. And the AI can very efficiently look through all of these possibilities and find the right compounds.
Right. The poor little mouse, is there a way we can do that in silico? Like have the mouse in silico? I do think like regulations are still going to put it as an obligatory step, but how can we fast track / accelerate the drug discovery process?
Oh man, yeah. it's really unfortunate that we have to use these animal models. Currently there aren't any models that could convince the FDA that a drug is going to be safe and efficacious and put into humans unless it's been put into animals, often multiple animals. So it is unfortunate. I mean, I'm a vegetarian. I feel strongly that we should not harm animals, but I also see all the suffering in humans. And as a human, as a humanist, I'm a speciesist, and I prioritize other humans over animals in this case. So it's sort of a sad but calculated necessity to pushing drugs forward. Currently we don't have anything. I hope that we can develop really complex in silico models that would replace or some aspects of this research.
I guess that's an incentive for you to build better models that won't kill the poor thing, or at least make it suffer. Because yeah, that must be a somewhat of a sad portrait. And to go back and analyze the tape and so forth, us back in days, we were having these mice swim. I forgot the name of that experiment, but there was like this obstacle,
Yeah.
this like little island.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, okay. Well,
Let's
like
hit Zuzalu before we run out of time here, because I think that was a really cool event that you were curious about.
yes, let's take like 5 more minutes for this pod, and yeah, we can reschedule round two eventually. But tell us about like what happened there, because as I was listening to you talk, with the mice thing and the FDA, I'm like, why not create our own country and not have these bullshit laws, to fast track the experiment. Anyway, tell us about the event.
Yeah, so you're talking about network states, right?
Yes.
Uh, an idea that was popularized by Balaji's book. And so this event was called Zuzalu, and it's a highly aligned online community that had a pop-up city in Montenegro. It was started by Vitalik from Ethereum, as well as a bunch of people from VitaDAO, which is a distributed funding organization for science, specifically longevity science. So it was an incredible mix of crypto, AI, network state, and longevity creators, funders. We had tons of amazing talks. And it was amazing. The idea is that, by organizing together, we can convince countries like Montenegro to accept aging as an indication. So currently in the United States, you could be 75 years old and severely degenerated, but in the normal range and have no exact diagnosable disease. And there's no regulatory path to treat this person in the United States, to get something approved for that. Aging is not an indication in the United States, but Montenegro is now going to recognize aging as an indication itself. And so this is through, this advocacy and collective bargaining power of this online community.
I think it's cool, but when I look at these countries as well, I think it was like the Bitcoin project in South America or in Africa. It's like these countries that are trying to stand out, but are just not there yet. Montenegro is probably not that necessarily. Montenegro. My brain is like asking, Montenegro, is that a country or a city?
It's a country. Yeah. Yeah.
So okay, yeah. So I just got the confirmation. Well, it's not the country's not there yet, economically and all of that. And I think they're just trying to stand out in a weird way, and I'm not sure that is the way to go. Peter Thiel's thesis was to build that kind of floatable station in the ocean. Then there's people that want to do that, but with boats. You think that it's the right way to go to establish like a community inside a country and be so dependent on them?
Yeah, I think we can try all of the above. I don't think that there's going to be one network state with one purpose. I think the point is that you can pull from the entire world people that have similar ideas, and you can organize them in a really powerful way. And so perhaps for longevity people, they need a special economic zone with special regulations that allow them to advance their science. and get legitimacy. I think the indication is really about legitimacy. So people, when you're pitching venture capital firms to try to get investment, and you're trying to develop a longevity treatment, if there's no legitimate path to approval, well, they're not going to invest in it, right? So I think that's the focus of the longevity network state, but there are probably many other network states that are already forming around their personal project.
Right. Okay, blow our minds for the last minute or two here and tell us about neurotech and your predictions and BCI and AGI. Where do you factor that in the whole scheme of things? Because theoretically, if we have an AGI, we can probably crack longevity, right? So any predictions or a plan of yours of what you will focus on the next few years and yeah, possible battle plan to crack all of that.
Yeah, so there was a lot there. So you're talking about neurotech, AGI, and longevity.
BCI, everything connected together.
Yeah, and longevity. Currently I'm not too hopeful that any current AIs will crack longevity. But who knows? Like an AGI, it has this mysterious quality, like it could be this all-powerful being that can do all sorts of things. I'm not counting on it. I think that we should all, continue to advance the science. This is ultimately, these AIs are trained on data. So we need to generate the data right now. It'd be great if we had AI-enabled robots that would go out and collect this data, but we're not trying to advance AI longevity. We're still studying humans ultimately. So we need to organize humans and do these experiments and collect this data so that we could feed it into the AI in the first place. So I'm not really holding my breath for that one. I think that there's been a lot of hype around AI, and the language models are really fun. I use them all the time, even in my research. But I think we're pretty far from AGI. But who knows? The whole concept is that this really feeds in on itself and accelerates rapidly, right? Like the singularity concept. I don't really have a battle plan. I just am aligned with human values. And that's something that's going to be difficult to train an AI, right? There's a lot of discussions about the alignment problem. And so me as a human, I can empathize and care about other humans and work to better all of us. And I think if I just, stick to that and stick to my alignment and try to get as much AI power directed that direction, then that's all I can do for now. I mean, the mysterious godlike AGI that's going to come and either kill us all or save us all. It's hard to have a discussion about it because there's so many unknowns.
Yeah, probably something in between, something grayer. Louis, thank you so much for being here today. You added lots of value, and that was a cool convo. Where can people find out more about you and your companies?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn, Luis Rios. Currently our companies are in stealth mode. So, you can reach out to me directly on LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to chat with you if you're interested in getting involved.